Welcome friends. Today we have with us Nirupama Kulkarni. She is presently a research director at Capital Associated Institute with RBI. She is an applied empirical economist and her research interest includes corporate finance, banking, household finance, real estate and monetary policy. Nirupama has an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering from IIT Bombay, an MBA from Stern School, and then PhD from UC Berkeley. And today she is going to talk about her work on home ownership and the American dream and analysis of intergenerational mobility effects. So, Nirupama, I think it will take around 50 minutes for your paper, and then in between you are free to ask questions. So, about an hour, 10 minutes. Okay, so it's up to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to present. I'll be presenting this paper on home ownership and the American dream, an analysis of intergenerational mobility effects. And this is joint work with Ulrike Malmendier at UC Berkeley. So owning a home has been considered an integral part of achieving the American dream. And basically the idea is that home owning enables social mobility not only for homeowners themselves, but also the children of homeowners. And this sort of positive association or the idea that home owning benefits everyone is something that is prevalent not only in the US, but it is prevalent all across the world. So for example, PM Narendra Modi has made reference to this idea that everyone should own homes by 2022. In fact, the previous budget had tax incentives which were targeted at encouraging home owning, especially for the young. And well, this is going to be a very sort of US specific context. So even in the US, what they found was that during the crisis period, that is in periods when house prices were falling, then negative equity in homes reduced residential mobility for homeowners. And so this literature has emphasized the flip side of home owning, that is the negative part of home owning. And and like I said, this is again very US centric, but what I want to sort of say is that this is also a little bit relevant for the Indian context as well. And I hope this paper sort of at least motivates a reason to revisit or at least rethink this idea that home owning is beneficial to all. So coming back to the US context, this idea of the benefits of home ownership is held across the political spectrum. So here are two quotes by former US presidents. So the first quote by President Bill Clinton goes like this: "No person, even the president, can say you will always have the job you have today, but we can guarantee to people that we're going to empower them to help themselves. We'll make home ownership more accessible." And in a similar vein, the quote by George Bush goes like this: "We can put light where there's darkness and hope where there's despondency in this country. And part of it is working together as a nation to encourage folks to own their home." Now this policy focus on increasing home ownership has been prevalent in the US since the 1930s, right since Fannie Mae was set up. And not only do these policies encourage home owning for everyone, and specifically for low-income borrowers, but they also encourage home owning in low-income neighborhoods. So for example, the 1992 GSE Act encourages home owning within certain census tracts, that is certain neighborhoods within large cities, and specifically low-income neighborhoods within large cities. Prior literature, this is a weaker, older literature, has found this positive association between home owning and children's outcomes. And basically, this literature can be divided into two strands. One is the direct benefits of home owning. So home owning provides residential stability because homeowners are tied to a particular area and hence their children have more stable lives. And the other idea is that home owning is a sort of is a tool for wealth creation. Now the second strand of literature emphasizes the externalities of home ownership. So the idea is that homeowners are tied to a particular area, and as a result they are likely to invest not only in the home itself, but also in the neighborhood surrounding the home. So they are more likely to be involved in the local community, and hence home ownership is also associated with higher social capital. Now, as I had mentioned, the financial crisis has highlighted the flip side of home owning. So mortgagers who were locked into their homes because of falling house prices and negative equity in their homes were unable to move to other areas or in search of better employment opportunities. Now, this flip side of home owning might not be true just for the crisis periods. It might be true for even good times, at least for some particular areas. So in this paper, we are going to look at the link between home ownership and intergenerational mobility. So intergenerational mobility, I'll define it more clearly in the next few slides, but basically it's the correlation between the parents' income and children's income. And so we look at the link between home ownership and intergenerational mobility, and then see whether this is unambiguously positive, and in particular, is it uniform across locations, or is it particularly strong for certain low-income areas? So the basic idea is we are going to relate commuting zone level or city level home ownership rates to intergenerational mobility. And then we are going to see how this varies on average, and then second, how this differs across location, and finally, we are going to look at the spillovers of home ownership. So the analysis is going to be carried out in 3 steps. So the first step is to look at the average effects. That is, how does home ownership affect intergenerational mobility? And as I had mentioned, the intergenerational mobility measure is basically a correlation of between the parent's rank and the child's income. And this measure is provided by Chetty and Hendren, and it basically provides the causal impact of on a child of growing up in a particular city or commuting zone. So let me just again say that commuting zone is basically very similar to a city. It's areas which are otherwise economically integrated. So this is the first step, and in the second step, we look at the heterogeneity across areas. So we look at differences across segregation of income and differences in racial segregation. And finally, we look at the spillovers of home ownership. So to do this, we construct an index of segregation of home ownership, which is, are homeowners more likely to be surrounded by other homeowners, or is there a mix of homeowners and renters across the city? And then we examine what are the spillovers of, through this segregation index, we examine what are the spillovers of home ownership, and finally, we try to determine the channel through which home ownership is affecting children's outcomes. So before I go to the preview of findings, I want to first set up how this intergenerational mobility is measured. This measure is from Chetty and Hendren, and actually it's based on a series of papers by Arat Chetty. They use confidential federal income tax records from 96 to 2012. And the basic idea is this. They look at the parents and look at the parents' income when the child was growing up. And then they rank the parents' income across at the national level. And they do the same thing for children. That is, they look at children's income when they're adult, and then again rank it across the nation. And then they look at the intergenerational mobility measure as the correlation between the rank of parents and the rank of children. So they find that this relationship is almost perfectly linear. Now let me try to make this even more concrete. So this is a graph from their paper, and basically this is a bin scatter plot. I'll define what that is. But the x-axis has the parent rank in the national income distribution, and the y-axis has the child rank in the national income distribution. And we're looking at the intergenerational mobility measures in 2 cities, that is San Francisco and Chicago. And what this bin scatter plot does is it divides the x-axis into percentiles of 2 percentile bins, and then we plot the average of the x-axis against the y-axis. And one striking thing here is, and the red line is Chicago, and the blue line is San Francisco. And one striking thing here is that this relationship is almost perfectly linear. In addition, if you focus on just these low-income families, that is children of parents below the median family income, we see that in San Francisco, the outcomes for children are higher than the outcomes for children in Chicago. But when you look at the high-income families, we find that this relationship flips. So this was just the correlational measure. In a subsequent paper, they also, Chetty and Hendren also look at the causal intergenerational mobility measure. And basically, how they get at this is consider two families, they focus on the movers. So consider two families where one family moves when the child is young and one family moves when the child is old. And what they're going to do is compare the outcomes of these two children. And the idea is that the child that moved when young has a higher impact of neighborhood compared to the child that moved when he was old. And so they're going to sort of look at the differential impact on the young children and versus the old children and attribute that to the causal impact of growing in a neighborhood. And the identifying assumption here is that the timing of moves is orthogonal to the children's potential outcomes. And they do a bunch of robustness checks to show that this is indeed, in fact, causal. So it's robust to when they restrict to movers who move due to exogenous shocks, such as earthquake or plant closings. Now, we are going to focus on the above median income families and the below median income families. So we're going to look at the average intergenerational mobility measure of the children of all above median income families and all below median income families. And given the linearity of this rank-rank relationship, this basically corresponds to the 25th and the 75th percentile. Okay, so here is the preview of our findings. We find that there is a significant impact of average homeownership rate on intergenerational mobility. That is, there's a significant impact of homeownership on the causal effect of growing up in a given neighborhood. So one standard deviation higher homeownership rate is associated with about a 0.065 standard deviation increase in the intergenerational mobility measure for above median income families. And this is slightly lower at 0.059 for the below median income families. And we find that this effect, and second, then we look at the heterogeneity across locations. And we find that this effect is significantly weaker in income segregated areas. That is, in areas with one standard deviation higher income segregation, this positive association between homeownership and intergenerational mobility is diminished by about 33% for the above median income families and by about 41% for the below median income families. So to summarize this first set of findings, we find that there are better outcomes for children for both the above and below median income families, but there is significant place-based heterogeneity.
So, could you please explain the causal interpretation? You've been mentioning that this is a causal effect, but can you elaborate on that a bit?
So, okay, so the causal estimate of intergenerational mobility is from the Chetty and Hendren paper. So one would be, the first paper just did something like they looked at the rank of children versus parents, and that was the first graph. And in the second paper, what they tried to identify off of is children who move at, say, when the child was 12 versus when the child was 16. And then they looked at the difference in this intergenerational mobility measure and then attributed it to the neighborhood. So the way they established sort of that this is indeed causal is through like a bunch of robustness checks. One is these closings, that is the families did not themselves move because of some endogenous choice. That is, they wanted their children to go to, say, better schools or something like that. Second, what they show is that, in fact, they look at their own cohort. So if a child who was 12, then his own cohort is a very good predictor of how the child does. And they find that, and that's very difficult to estimate for a parent. And so that's one way how they justify, they call these over-identification tests, and that's one way in which they sort of justify that this is indeed causal.
So you are basically using their causal relationship to dig a little deeper and see what is happening in different.
That's right. So we want something which is the causal effect of growing up in a neighborhood. So yeah.
So the identification restriction is not related to any of them. Can you elaborate?
So basically the idea is that if, so for example, if I believe that my child who is in kindergarten, school doesn't really, it's just kindergarten, it's pretty much same everywhere, then I don't move at that, as in I enroll him in any school. But I know that once he starts approaching, say, the 10th grade, then it becomes more and more important, so then I move. So that would invalidate this identification assumption. So again, the way they sort of address those questions is through this test. That is, they, so for example, parents know that certain regions are better for their kids, but they might not, they might even know that, say, it's better for girls but not for boys. But it's very unlikely that they will know that it's better for this cohort of kid who's 12 now versus not for the cohort which was younger than him. Okay, so in a second set of findings, we look at the spillovers of homeownership. So to do this, we build a segregation of homeownership measure, which basically looks at whether you're more likely to be surrounded by other homeowners or whether there's a mix of renters versus homeowners. And we find that when the segregation of homeownership increases by 1 standard deviation, the intergenerational mobility of the below median income families diminishes by about 1.14 standard deviation. However, we find that this does not seem to have any impact on the high income families. And this effect of segregation of homeownership is over and above other measures of segregation, which is surprisingly school, race, and income segregation.
The primary, as he was asking, the primary causal effect is the impact of neighborhood on intergenerational. Right?
Their paper is, the Ratchety paper is about neighborhood on intergenerational mobility.
Here you bring in ownership in that neighborhood.
That's right. So how much of the so what about the neighborhood matters?
And how do you define ownership? Is it like, because all this, mortgage,
right. It's just whether or not you own a home.
So no, because people may own it and may not be able to pay the mortgage and
So that is still you own the home.
So you're still classified as, and during the entire growing up phase of the child, you're still owning the.
Right. So the way we are going to measure is going to be based off of the census data. So we're going to look at the average homeownership rates. Now, in a second phase of this of this paper, we are going to get the IRS data.
It's not the household level.
Not the household level, because because this is more about the neighborhood effects. I think we are sort of ambivalent about whether it is the exact direct effect of homeowning or the externality.
Mobility outcomes are also again
the city level.
Oh, yeah. The city level.
Yeah. So the reason that you don't look at the more granular level is because there's a lot of sorting within commuting zone levels, and so you aggregate it up and then you get the aggregate city level.
Because it's like two really distant time periods, right? In the child, when you're trying to measure this intergenerational mobility.
No, so we look at we use the when I come to the data, it'll sort of, I try to match it. But basically, I'm going to look at the 2000 census data, and that is around the time when when the parents' income was measured.
And then the child?
The child income is measured when he's adult. So actually what you want is not the child, so ideally you would actually want the child to sort of grow up and then leave that place, right? Because we don't want to look at the impact of that area when he's an adult. And in fact, in the data, they find that 30% of the children move from like their place of where they grew up. So we don't want so the child's, so the child's income is measured, they have the data. So we don't need that, right? So they have linked, yeah. We do. So I don't need it, they do. So, and they do have that. Chetty and Raj Chetty and Henry. Yeah. Yeah.
And so you're just taking their data set to...
For the intergenerational mobility.
Okay.
Regarding
how do you doing this market effect of, say, children living with their parents? So it may be so that children are moving out of their parents' home. So this particular census data would only measure the household members. Would only would only contain those who are living with their parents, right, at the household level. So if there is a systematic bias that comes in because of the children leaving their house, or what exactly does the census?
So basically, okay, so there are two parts that we are using, right? One is the intergenerational mobility measure, which is what I was talking about as their measure, which is the Raj Chetty measure. And what they have is the income of parents and then the income of children when they're adult, because they have the exact IRS, income tax records, okay? So there, to convince me that this is just a systematic effect, then we need to show that, okay, somehow there are effects which sort of bias towards finding my result that homeownership rate impacts children's outcomes.
So a given household would contain a set of parents, set of children. So does the census contain a question wherein it asks for the income of the parents' parents and the children's parents? So children's parents are already there, so they would be get the information there. But what about the parents?
Oh, I get your point. That it is like it's like if the parent is a homeowner but he's not really a homeowner, he's just staying in his parents' place. Actually, that's a good question. We have not controlled for that, and maybe I should add that control. But I think at this period that was not so much as a concern as it is like, during the current sort of scenario. But yeah, I think we should add that and just check. Okay, so in this set of results, we find that segregation of homeownership adversely affects the below median income families.
So what is that residential stability?
What is that?
Residential stability.
Oh, residential stability. So one idea could be that, okay, we are not really capturing anything about homeownership. It's just that where homeownership rates are high, the neighborhood is just more stable. So we add a control for like if there are a large percentage or a large fraction of people who have been living in a neighborhood for more than 10 years, which captures this idea of residential stability. And our results are over and above that residential stability measure.
So it's competent for schooling, global schooling, I suppose. The racial composition, income segregation, everything. Homeownership turns out to be the...
Right. Excuse me? Which is really surprising, yeah. So I'll talk about that in much detail before, but the basic idea is that we look at, so there's a city and then there are little tracts or little neighborhoods within the city, and then we look at how different is a tract composition of homeownership rate from the entire city. So if it is very different, that is all homeowners are clumped together, then it's very segregated, whereas it's very similar, then it's less segregated. Okay, but that's the basic gist.
So that's a measurement that you have done in your study.
Yeah, but it's in it's in the spirit of other measurements such as the segregation of income, and we also tried sort of modifying that segregation measure. So one idea is that, okay, it's not just the census tract measures. It might be that even neighboring tracts are important for me, because if they have homeowners, they might also impact me. And the baseline sort of measure is pretty much captures all this variation. and that doesn't really make much of a difference.
One question on the last findings that you had said that we're looking at city level data, Chetty and we had looked at individual data. And how
He had took the individual data and he built up like measures of the cause and effect of growing up.
and what you were getting there is a correlation and not cause.
No, we get
it's at the city level.
no, it's the causal component of
Because
yeah.
but then they were comparing those children who had or those parents who had moved out when the child was young. So they were comparing those two.
Right.
But you were looking at the city level.
Yeah, so comparing those two, you get a measure of the effect of growing up in a neighborhood, right? Which is the causal component of growing up in a neighborhood. And we use that one, that measure, which is the causal component of growing up in a neighborhood.
And that's not a correlation.
That's the causal component of growing. So you're asking, what's the difference between is it the causal component of growing up as a homeowner versus not, right? So again, like I said, we are ambivalent about that because we are going to actually look at the spillovers of homeownership. So basically, this idea that owning a home has externalities, that is, it sort of benefits the community as a whole. And so it's fine if you're not comparing the causal component of intergenerational mobility of homeowners versus renters. But that is something we sort of plan to do in the next phase of the project. Okay, and then we look at the channel through which this segregation of homeownership is affecting children's outcomes. And we find that this is actually only through the social capital, that is this idea of externalities of homeownership. And it surprisingly does not depend, it's not through school quality. And specifically, we find that the segregation of homeownership and the homeownership of below median income families tends to lower the social capital of the city. Okay, so here are just some summary statistics. So first I'll show you the intergenerational mobility measure. That's the causal component of growing up in a city for 20 years. And this shows the heat map for the above median income families, and this shows the heat map for the below median income families. And the darker colors correspond to higher percentiles of intergenerational mobility, that is higher outcomes for children. And you can see that there's a lot of geographical variation. So for example, for here, the south seems to be bad, particularly bad for children of below median income families, whereas for the above median income families, it seems to be the west coast, which is almost similar to what we saw for San Francisco in that the linear graph that I showed you. And then we look at the homeownership rates, and this comes from the 2000 census. And again, higher values correspond to higher homeownership rates. And there is, in fact, a lot of variation in homeownership rates. It goes from a low of 43 to 84%. And again, the West Coast seems to have a low homeownership rates in general during this period. So our data comes from the decennial census. Most of our control variables come from the decennial census. And I'll talk about instruments, which also, the data for which also comes from the decennial census. And for the social capital index, we get it from Rupasinghe and Goetz. And this is basically a county level measure which looks at the fraction of people who return their census forms, the voter turnout rates, and other measures of participation. And counties are areas within a commuting zone, so we aggregate it up to the commuting zone using a population weighted average. So this is the baseline empirical specification. So we basically regress the intergenerational mobility measure at the commuting zone level on the homeownership rate at the commuting zone level. And I'm going to describe some instruments in the next few slides. So in the instrumented variable regression, we basically, the first stage will instrument for homeownership, and then we use the instrumented homeownership rate to look at the impact on intergenerational mobility. And the controls that we include are for the age of households, on the percentage of single working mothers, which Chetty and Hendren found to be the single most important factor in determining intergenerational mobility. The percentage below poverty level, percentage divorced, racial composition, unemployment rates, and also whether it intersects a metropolitan area. And we do a population weighted, we population weight these regressions, and it's clustered at the state level. And so before I move to the instruments, let me say that these are not great instruments. So if you have other ideas, it would be very helpful. But these are the instruments that have been used in the previous literature or inspired by the previous literature. And I think if there might be problems in each one of them, but perhaps using both of them together might address some of your concerns. So the first instrument is the single family detached homes. So this idea is inspired by Glaser and Shapiro, who instrument for individual homeownership in '93 using the MSA level percentage of single family detached homes a decade before. So the basic idea is that home owning tends to be in these single family detached homes and not in apartment complexes. And so we instrument for current homeownership rates using the stock of single family detached homes. So our instrument is basically this commuting zone level homeownership. Our instrument is basically the commuting zone level percentage of single family homes to the total housing units in 1990. So this is like our first stage regression in a graphical form. So the x-axis is the percentage of single family detached homes in 1990. The y-axis is the homeownership rate. And again, this is a bin scatter plot with 5 percentile bins. And we see that the percentage of single family detached homes in 1990 does a good job of predicting the homeownership rate in 2000, especially for the high homeownership rates. So it's like the stock of homes of units which are probably going to be owned by people. The second instrument we use is the house price shock a decade before. That is when the parents were most likely to become homeowners. And this house price shock basically captures the idea of affordability of owning homes. So we look at the difference in the median house price value between 1980 to 1990, and we use that to instrument for homeownership rate. And like I said, this approximately corresponds to the affordability when the parents were about 35 years of age. And there are two surveys which show that this is around the average age where people become first-time home buyers. And this is again the first stage where we have difference in median house price value between 1980 and 1990 against homeownership rate in 2000. And as homes become less affordable, home ownership rate is lower. And lower the house price shock, higher is the home ownership rate. Okay, and here are the summary statistics. So one thing I want to point out is basically the home ownership rate. I think the one thing that is surprising is that firstly the home ownership rate is about 70% on average, and what is surprising is that there seems to be a wide variation in the home ownership rate. And also the causal intergenerational mobility measure for the below median income families is about 3.69. That is on average for the cities in our sample. The causal impact of growing in a neighborhood for 20 years meant that the income of these children was 3.69 percentage points higher, whereas for the above median income families, this measure was 2.45. So what this is in fact saying is that, so you notice that this is higher than this. So what this is saying is that the effect of growing, the causal impact of a neighborhood is higher for the below median income families than the above median income families on average. Sorry, Thiel. Okay, so I'll come to this, but basically this is going to be the racial segregation measure. And these are all in the same spirit. So the segregation of income, Thiel index, and segregation of homeownership are basically what I was saying. That is, you look at the racial composition of a little neighborhood and compare it to the racial composition of the entire city. Okay, and so this is our baseline result in graphical form. So this is the above median income families and this is the below median income families. And these are again bin scatter plots in 5 percentile bins. And we're looking at home ownership rate against the intergenerational mobility measure. And you see that for both the below median and above median income families, it seems that the higher the home ownership rate, higher is the intergenerational mobility measure. And these effects also seem to be of very similar magnitudes. We do it more formally in a regression analysis. So the top panel looks at the above median income families, the bottom panel for the below median income families. And let me just summarize because this is basically what you saw in the previous slide except with controls and instrumenting for home ownership. And what we find is that the 1 standard deviation higher home ownership rate of the commuting zone results in a 0.65 standard deviation higher income rank for the below median income families. Okay, so now we look at the heterogeneity across areas. Why are there? So yeah, so like here you add the controls and they become high, which is like 0.2 is I think it's not, yeah. So the second part we look at the heterogeneity across areas, and the idea is that does homeownership exacerbate the effect of living in bad neighborhoods, and especially in highly segregated areas. Again, the idea is that how was the composition of a small tract or a small neighborhood relative to the entire city. So the segregation of income measure is from Reardon et al. And there they look at the degree to which a population below the pth percentile is segregated from a population above the pth percentile. And basically they construct a two-group entropy index, and this is the main variable of interest, which is, and this entropy index is calculated for both the neighborhood, that is the tract, as well as the entire city. And here we look at how different is the neighborhood composition compared to the entire city. So the farther away they are, the higher is the segregation index. And this is done for each percentile P, and then you just do a weighted average of across all the percentiles. Okay, and now we look at the segregation across areas. So I have 10 minutes. Okay. So what we do is we split the commuting zones into high segregation and low segregation areas. So these are the low segregation areas and these are the high segregation areas. And the basic plot is it repeats what we saw previously for our baseline regression. And the top panel is for the above median income families. And we find that we still have this positive association between homeownership and intergenerational mobility measure for the low segregation areas. And this is slightly diminished for the high segregation areas. But when we move to the 25th percentile, this becomes almost flat for the low segregation areas. And for the high segregation areas, this is also flat and even in fact slightly negative. That is, higher home ownerships seem to have a detrimental impact on intergenerational mobility. This is not statistically significant.
The answer before 25th percentile, that's interesting. What do we interpret that on the middle? I mean, this end of the tail doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, and so here there are no controls. This is when we actually sort of do the OLS, we still get very similar results.
The Raj paper, what do you see the neighborhood effect for the 25th percentile?
They look at the neighborhood effect. So one thinks of their entire effect as capturing something about the neighborhood, but it is a neighborhood effect. But we don't know what about the neighborhood is giving this effect. Okay. So they do use segregation, and they find that segregation has an impact, but what they don't do is home ownership. And so we are not talking about just the impact of low segregation, it is that home owning compounds the effect of segregation, right? Negative. Right, as in, so like when we do it more formally in the regression, so again we have, this is for the 75th percentile, but let's see for the 25th percentile. This is weak, but let me concentrate on the one that is instrumented. So this is the baseline, that is higher homeownership rate also implies higher intergenerational mobility. But we find that when you look at, and what Chetty's paper does is it looks at just income segregation. And we in fact find again a negative effect. That is, high segregated areas have a detrimental impact on intergenerational mobility. But what we are trying to say is that the homeowning compounds this bad neighborhood effect because you're basically locked in or stuck in a particular neighborhood.
Isn't there a need to adjust for house prices in areas that are segregated? Isn't there a possibility that areas that are segregated themselves don't command the real estate?
So yes. So let me first say that they themselves also look at whether areas which are better for children somehow have their idea of, like, our house price is higher, and they do not find that. It doesn't seem to be priced in. Okay, and so basically what we are trying to show here is that there's heterogeneity across areas, and this positive association between homeownership and intergenerational mobility is diminished by about 41 to 42% for the below median income families. Okay, so now we try to sort of dig in deeper into these findings, and we want to look at the direct versus the indirect effects. So we will not be, with this aggregate data, we will not be able to separate out the direct and indirect effects, but basically we are thinking of, we are not able to do it cleanly, but we'll sort of try to get at it by looking at the homeownership rates of the above median income families. This is for the direct effects, and for the indirect effects we look at the segregation of homeownership. Okay. So the segregation of homeownership measure is very similar to the segregation of income measure, except when we calculate the entropy measure, we just replace this with the homeownership rate. And again, the idea is whether the homeownership rate composition of a neighborhood, that is a small census tract, is very different from the homeownership rate of the entire commuting zone of the city level. So the farther away they are, the higher is the segregation. Okay, and so this is again a way of looking at the summary statistics. So this is a heat map of the segregation of homeownership measure, and we find that there is significant variation. In fact, the previous slide had shown that homeownership rates were lower on the west coast, but segregation is still high, and there doesn't seem to be an exact correlation between this and homeownership rates. Okay, so we look at, so let me first set this up. Columns 1 and 2 look at the intergenerational mobility measure for the above median income families, and columns 3 and 4 for the below median income families. So first we look at how the homeownership rate of the above median income families varies with how that impacts intergenerational mobility for the children of above median income families. And we find that sort of the familiar result that the higher homeownership rate of above median income families implies higher intergenerational mobility. Now in the second column, we also throw in this new segregation of homeownership variable, and surprisingly we find that there is no effect at all on the children of above median income families. Now we repeat that, but now we have the dependent variable as the below median income, the children of the below median income families. And again, we find that the homeownership rate of the below median income families does not have an impact on the intergenerational mobility of the of below median income families. And when we throw in the segregation of homeownership measure, this has a negative and strong impact on sort of the below median income families. And here we look at the gap. So we look at whether how the gap between the 25th percentile relative to the 75th percentile. And we find that this gap diminishes when homeownership rate of the above median income families is higher. The below median income family does not seem to have any impact. And the segregation of homeownership again has detrimental impact on intergenerational mobility of the 25th percentile relative to the 75th percentile. And so the summary of all this is that segregation of homeownership matters for the below median income families, but not for the above median income families.
On the segregation of homeownership, just a clarification, how we need to know intra-commuting zone information, right, to do that. And do we have that information here? How do we calculate this P?
It's the track level.
You have a track level information inside. Okay.
That's right, yeah. So like in results which I've even not shown, we can even think about like so just now, right now we just do home owning of the tract versus the entire commuting zone, but we can think of home owning of the very poor guys relative to everybody, and we've done a couple of tests with that, but I don't show it sort of in this presentation. So now we look at all the other measures, that is racial segregation, which is very similar to the measures we have seen before, except we replace that P with race compositions. Then the segregation of poverty, which is basically the income segregation measure which I had shown on the first income segregation slide. And this looks at the segregation of households below the 25th percentile compared to the rest. And for the segregation of affluence, it's just for the 75th percentile. That is this, but with the 75th percentile as the cutoff. And finally, we look at school exposure, which is how diverse is the peer group of children at these schools. Okay, and this is just repeating column 5 of the previous slide, except we are going to change this variable. And it includes these two variables, but those are not shown here. And this is the result before. And then we find, and remember this includes controls. And we find that this gap between the 25th and 75th percentile is not affected by racial segregation, segregation of income, segregation of poverty, affluence of school exposure. And in fact, when we do the horse race, this is the one that turns out to be the most significant. Okay, and this is what you were asking about residential stability. So again, the idea is that it could be that what we are capturing is just that areas with high home ownership rates also have are just stable areas. So we control for it by adding in this variable, which is the fraction of households which have stayed in an area for more than 10 years. And the effects are over and that we find are over and above this residential stability measure. And finally, we try to tease out what's the channel through which this is happening. So basically, we are going to repeat the same regressions as before, except the dependent variable is now going to be the social capital index from Rupa Singha and Goetz. And this is constructed at the county level using voter turnout rates and the fraction of people who return the census forms and sort of other measures. And this social capital index captures the spirit of involvement in local government that the Pascual and Laser have pointed out, and that's what most policy papers are sort of thinking about, or most policy is thinking about. And we find that social capital index is higher in areas where homeownership rates are higher for the rich or the above median income families, and in fact it decreases when homeownership rates of the below median income families increases. And importantly, it's again lower when segregation of homeownership is higher. And this looks at a measure of school quality, that is the dropout rate of schools. And surprisingly, this does not seem to have any effect on, homeownership does not seem to have any effect on school quality. And this is a surprising result because I think the common intuition that people have is that it's somehow through the peers of these children that all this effect of homeownership is working. But this is consistent with the paper by David Card and Jesse Rothstein, who also show that for the black-white wage gap, the segregation of the neighborhood seems to matter more than the peer group diversity. And finally, to conclude, we find that there is a positive association between homeownership rate and intergenerational mobility measure, and this is robust to using this causal measure of intergenerational mobility. However, we find that there is significant place-based heterogeneity. And we find that, again, that there are similar effects when one looks at homeownership and segregation of homeownership and social capital. So the broad gist is that, basically questions this policy focus on increasing homeownership. So maybe there are other alternative policies, such as encouraging investment in human capital or moving out, which might help in achieving the American dream. And maybe these alternate policies could guarantee better housing quality and thus be more effective. And that's the paper. Right. Captures involvement in the local community. So how likely are you to vote? To basically vote. Yeah.
Kind of captures sense of belonging.
Yeah, that's right. That is, it's like, yeah, I think that makes intuitive sense. Yeah, positive externality, yeah. That's right. And that is, again, the emphasis of like, why do we care about this? It's what has been emphasized in like policy circles. So the idea is that, so because of the recent crisis, so the first effect, that is what people thought about previously, was a direct effect of homeowning, which would be that, it's a way of wealth creation. But because of the recent crisis, we know that that's not really true. Firstly, you're locked in, you can't move to better neighborhoods, or your wealth is diminished when the market as a whole takes a downturn. And if you're working, and your local employment also goes down. So everything is sort of tied together. So the direct effects we know is not true. So the only thing that's left is the externality of homeownership. That is that homeowners tend to be better citizens. And yeah, and this is getting at that.
So high home ownership should be positively correlated to social capital. Also, like because more people own their home there, so they can be more invested into creating public good.
But we don't, so we only find that's true for the above median income homeowners, and for the below median homeowners, in fact, there's a negative effect, because it's almost like, you're locked into an area, and so you tend to maybe not invest or you don't have the capacity to invest in the neighborhood. In fact, there are papers which have looked at, I think, like in areas where there are foreclosures, there seem to be significant spillovers. And that could be again tied to like the negative impact of homeowning, or the negative spillovers of homeowning.
Do you see similar thing happening in places like Bangalore, where slum dwellers are given homes and they do not find because they are below 25 percentiles, and see that similar things not happening?
Yeah, so I want to look at that. In fact, we are just getting data on affordable homes, and basically to see whether this has an impact on the house prices of surrounding areas. Yeah, maybe it's true, or maybe it might be that, but then again the trade-off is maybe these low-income families, maybe they are better off. So if that is something that we want to target, maybe that's not bad.
So in the Indian context, typically we have the opposite story, that the wealthier the people are becoming, the lesser time they spend for creating social capital. So it should actually go the other way around, that in the neighborhoods where people are not that wealthy, so if I need an ambulance at 12 at night, I can call someone and call. Whereas in a sort of rich neighborhood, no one would be bothered to go. So in a sense, it's
so the way I think about it is that the only positive that can be is this social capital, and we don't even have this. So perhaps it might all be
Wealthy neighborhoods, they create a needed community and internalize whatever social capital they want to create and capture all.
Right.
And so
and that I don't even think of as social capital. So when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about more as, they tend to be more involved in the schools. So the schools benefit everyone. They tend to be more wary of like what their mayor does. And so I'm thinking about social capital in that sense.
So once, let's say in India, if you are able to do that, completely privatize all the services of the public good, you don't really have much incentive to create, or be participate in other civic engagements.
So
which is what you.
Yeah, which I completely agree with. I think that there is not much social capital, in the Indian context. So in fact, you don't even have like the slight positive of home owning that might be there in their context. You have only being tied down to like a particular.
Campus is insulated, and we don't care little about participation with DMC or whatever.
Are you also concluding for presence of government versus public, providing the amenities?
I think no. So these guys have a say in their local, in sort of the local. They can vote on with their feet. That they can vote for whether they can elect a mayor who is more interested in certain things versus others.
Okay, actually direct intervention.
Yeah, exactly. Which is not true of like India, right? As in we don't have.
So in terms of policy relevance, like what do you think we can think of?
The idea is that first that home owning is not all that it's cracked up to be. It's not like always all positive. And secondly, that home owning might also sort of tie down people to certain areas, and like you're saying, that is like the benefits of home owning might be it might not spill over to everybody, which is what people were thinking about when they say that homeowners are better citizens. It might be segregated or relegated to just certain sections of society or only the above median income homeowners.
So one question I have is, when you're thinking about the homeownership thing, you're saying that okay, it's tying down the people who own homes, right? So the effect you're looking at is intergenerational mobility, which is the effect on children. So there is a missing step in between, right? I mean that your parents are not able to move better jobs because they own homes, and that in turn has an effect on what the children are doing. So how do you explain that linkage? Because I was more concerned about the labor market outcomes of the parents.
Right.
That whether they are able to, and that would be a direct impact of.
Yeah, but I think that's like that is fine. That's like a different paper. But maybe I think we have run regressions where we basically look at the dependent variable as one of these intermediate outcomes, right? Which is what you're thinking about. Yeah, and then we took it out. But yeah, maybe I can just put that back in, which is we basically look at. I think we look at residential like mobility, like where homeownership rates are high, do people tend to stay longer in the area? But we are not able to measure the whether they want to stay or whether they have to stay because they're homeowners. Yeah, and I think there is a way to get at that by looking at employment shocks, which is like a Bartik shock or something like that, and then looking at whether sort of the impact, the outcomes were worse, because I think this was the period which coincided when like manufacturing itself was doing badly. Yeah, I think we can look at that.
So in some sense, the story goes from being stuck in a locality to not being able to find better jobs outside, to your not being able to provide to your children, and your children then having worse prospects.
And you got two instruments which work quite well. Did you try with other instruments where you saw that results are somewhat better?
Yeah, so one is one which has been very popularly used in the literature is a size instrument. So which is basically it looks at like the topography of an area, and it looks at sort of if you're surrounded by more water bodies, then there's not much room to expand, and otherwise there's like lots of room to expand. And our idea was that maybe when the topography is like very it's very open, there is homeownership rates might be higher. But we found very mixed results. And one is that the instrument itself has been very popular in like recently, but it has in like UC Berkeley, it's like nobody uses it because it's been found to be as in you don't know what you're capturing. So for example, people have looked at related that to real estate prices, And Arizona had high real estate prices, although the topography was like, it was pretty much flat. So there was a lot of stock that could be brought in. So it doesn't, it seems to capture something very particular. But in our context, I think it doesn't even make sense because our segregation of homeownership variable is related to this idea of sprawl or the spread of cities. So I think that's where it's becoming very murky, and so we don't use that. Thank you.
I think a couple of PhD students are working on intergenerational mobility. I think sometime or other they may contact you for.
Yeah, I would be very happy. Yeah, just shoot me an email and I would be happy to talk to you or help the idea. Yeah.
So thank you on behalf of IIMA for spending some time with us, and thank you for